Your
Summit.
Excellency, we should not allow anything to diminish the value, the stature, and the impact of the first African G20 presidency. This G20 Leader Summit has a responsibility not to allow the integrity and the credibility of the G20 to be weakened.
There are moments in global politics when a single image sums up the entire story. At the G20 summit in Johannesburg, the first ever hosted on African soil, that image wasn't a handshake or a speech. It was an empty chair. The seat reserved for the United States, the next country set to lead the G20, stood vacant from start to finish. No president, no senior delegation, just silence in a room full of leaders. And that absence became louder than anything said on stage. Most people expected the US to dominate the narrative. Instead, it became the biggest gap in the room. What followed wasn't chaos. It was Africa stepping forward with a level of confidence and clarity that even seasoned diplomats found surprising. The world moved on without Washington, and that single missing chair raised a bigger question. What happens when global leadership simply doesn't show up? Let's find out. There are diplomatic moments the world prepares for, rehearses for, and expects to unfold with perfect choreography. The opening of the G20 summit in Johannesburg was meant to be one of those moments. Africa hosting the G20 for the first time wasn't just symbolic, it was historic. Leaders flew in from every major economy. Motorcades lined the streets. Journalists gathered in clusters, waiting for quotes, reactions, and the usual choreography of global politics. And then, right in the middle of all that anticipation, something felt off. The United States seat, the one placed prominently, the one everyone assumes will be filled before any cameras roll, stayed empty. At first, it looked temporary. Maybe they were running late, maybe a scheduling shuffle, maybe a security delay. But as more leaders took their places and the room settled into that familiar diplomatic stillness, the absence became harder to ignore. The nameplate sat there like a reminder of something nobody wanted to acknowledge just yet. America wasn't coming. Not late, not delayed, just not there. It takes a certain kind of silence to make hundreds of people feel uncomfortable at the same time. This was that kind of silence. Leaders exchanged small glances. Delegates whispered to one another. Cameras panned over the hall and lingered on that single spot longer than usual, because visually, it captured everything. This summit was historic for Africa, but equally historic for the glaring absence of the United States, the very nation expected to take over leadership next year. When South African President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped onto the stage, the room regained its rhythm. He welcomed the leaders, set the tone, and did what any head of state must do when representing a continent's hopes. But even as he spoke, the symbolic weight of that empty seat hovered in the air. Everyone in the hall knew what it meant. You could see it in the careful politeness of the speeches, in the way diplomats carried themselves, in the extra attention the cameras gave to everyone but the missing delegate. And then came the moment that made the symbolism impossible to ignore, the closing ceremony. Ramaphosa lifted the wooden gavel, the traditional tool used to signal the official end of the summit and the ceremonial handover to the next G20 president. This time, that handover was supposed to go to the United States, but there was no one to hand it to. Ramaphosa completed the formality anyway, closing the summit with steady confidence, but the visuals spoke louder than any official statement. An African leader, hosting a historic gathering, ended the event by extending tradition toward a space. A silent transition to a nation that wasn't present to accept it.
And now moves on to the next president of the G20, which is the United States, where we shall see each other again next year. The summit is therefore closed.
In that moment, the obvious questions settled over the entire summit. Not whispered, not speculative, but unavoidable. Why did the United States choose not to show up at all? To understand why the United States skipped such a significant summit, you have to look beyond the empty chair and into the political atmosphere leading up to Johannesburg. The tension didn't appear overnight. It began with a claim, one pushed strongly by Donald Trump and echoed by his administration, that South Africa was violently persecuting its Afrikaner white minority. It was a claim South Africa firmly rejected, calling it misleading and inflammatory. But in Washington, it became the justification for stepping away from the G20 entirely.
You know, I'm not going to, we have a G20 meeting in South Africa. South Africa shouldn't even be in the Gs anymore because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told them I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
This wasn't the kind of disagreement resolved with a phone call. It was ideological, emotional, and highly political. Trump framed South Africa as hostile and unstable. South Africa saw Trump's framing as inaccurate and disrespectful. Neither side budged, and when neither side moves, diplomacy breaks before it even begins. But the strangest part wasn't the boycott itself. It was what happened after the boycott was already announced. According to officials, the White House tried to reverse the optics at the last minute by sending a junior embassy officer to represent the United States at the ceremonial handover. On paper, it looked like a fix. In reality, it sent a very different message. The G20 handover is typically done leader to leader, or at least minister to minister. Sending a lower-level official into a hall filled with heads of state wasn't just unusual, it was diplomatically tone-deaf. South Africa immediately rejected the plan. They weren't going to have the symbolic moment of Africa's first G20 hosting reduced to a handshake with someone whose job title wouldn't even appear in the summit headlines. To Pretoria, it felt like an insult dressed as a compromise. And when South Africa said no, Washington didn't send anyone else. So in the end, the United States had no senior delegation at all. For the rest of the G20 members, the message was clear. If the US chose not to be present, then the summit would move forward without them. And it did. But even as the meetings continued, the absence lingered. It wasn't just about who wasn't in the room. It was about the growing realization that the world's most powerful economy had willingly stepped away from a stage that it usually dominates. And when the US steps back, it changes more than seating arrangements. It shifts expectations. It creates space, political space, for others to lead, speak, and shape the agenda in ways that might not have been possible if Washington were sitting at the table. That's what made the boycott so consequential. It didn't just signal disagreement, it signaled disengagement. And when a country as influential as the United States disengages, it affects everything. Diplomatic energy, media framing, the tone of negotiations, the confidence of smaller nations, even the urgency with which other powers seize the moment. And this leads to the next question, the one that shaped the rest of the summit. If the United States refused to participate, how did Africa and the other G20 members respond to that vacuum? The moment it became clear that the United States wasn't coming, many expected hesitation, maybe even a diplomatic pause. After all, the G20 isn't a small forum. Its rhythm usually depends on the presence and energy of the biggest economies. When one of them steps back, especially the world's largest, the instinct is to slow down, reassess, and adjust. But Johannesburg didn't pause. If anything, South Africa leaned forward. Instead of waiting for the US to reconsider or sending quiet signals to Washington, hoping for a late appearance, South Africa moved with a level of confidence that surprised even seasoned observers. From the first day, Ramaphosa and his team made it clear. The summit wasn't going to be defined by who wasn't there, but by who was. The most symbolic demonstration of that came when South Africa broke G20 tradition by releasing the Leaders' Declaration on the very first day. Normally, the declaration is a carefully negotiated document unveiled at the end of the summit, after rounds of discussions and adjustments. But this time, South Africa pushed it out early, almost as a statement of intent. It signaled that Africa had arrived prepared, organized, and united, and that it would not allow the absence of one member, even a powerful one, to dictate its pace. And when you look at the content of the declaration, the picture becomes even clearer. The priorities reflected Africa's lived realities, climate-related disasters that burden economies already stretched thin, debt levels that trap poor nations into cycles of dependency, and the need for fair access to green technology and financing. These weren't academic points. There were structural issues affecting millions of lives across the global south. The United States had opposed many of these priorities for months. Argentina's Javier Milei, closely aligned with Trump, also skipped the summit. But almost every other major power supported the declaration. China backed it. Russia backed it. France, Germany, Canada, Japan, and the United Kingdom backed it. Even the European Union aligned with South Africa's focus. This wide support gave the summit a sense of cohesion that didn't rely on American participation. In other words, the vacuum turned out to be space for Africa to lead, for the global South to assert itself, and for other major players to step forward without waiting for a U.S. signal. But the declaration wasn't just a diplomatic achievement, it was also a reality check. It showed how deeply the global South's issues resonated with most of the world, and how sharply they contrasted with Washington's priorities under Trump's administration. And yet declarations are just words, unless they translate into action. They reflect shared concerns, but they don't automatically change realities. So while the G20 responded strongly, the next question hung in the air, one that mattered to every leader, every journalist, and every nation hoping for progress. For all the energy and unity in Johannesburg, did this bold agenda actually lead to concrete solutions? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Once the excitement of the early declaration settled, a quieter, more sobering reality began to surface. Global problems don't shift just because leaders agree on paper. Even with the unity shown by most G20 members, the Johannesburg summit ran straight into the same wall that has stalled so many international gatherings before it: the gap between shared intentions and actual solutions. The leaders' declaration was ambitious. It talked about climate recovery funds for vulnerable nations, restructuring unsustainable debt, and offering real support for green energy transitions. These are urgent issues for countries hit hardest by climate change and economic inequality, especially across Africa and the wider global South. The fact that these topics made it into the core of the G20 document was meaningful. It showed a shift in focus, a recognition that the world can't keep ignoring the problems affecting the majority of humanity. But when you look closer, something becomes clear. The declaration didn't have the teeth needed to change the direction of global politics. And that's not because South Africa lacked leadership or vision. It's because the G20 itself struggles to make binding decisions on the world's most sensitive crises. Take the Russia-Ukraine war. Despite having European leaders, EU representatives, and a Russian delegation in the same room, something rare in itself, the final document contained only a single, very general line calling for the end of global conflicts. No clear position, no actionable agreements, no diplomatic breakthrough. 4 years into the war, the G20 could not nudge the situation in any new direction. Then there's the Middle East. The tensions there have shaped global politics for decades. Yet the Johannesburg summit produced no major shift in approach, no new framework, no fresh proposals. The conflict remained a topic of discussion, but not a problem in finding a solution. Even the proposal for a new international panel on global wealth inequality, an idea South Africa and several others pushed strongly, didn't make it into the final text. It wasn't because the issue lacked importance. It was because creating such a panel would require long-term commitment, political will, and resources that some nations simply weren't ready to allocate. Debt relief, another critical point, also remained stuck. Many developing countries need mechanisms that ease debt burdens rather than deepen them. Yet the declaration could only acknowledge the problem, not solve it. Macron summed up the mood bluntly when he said that the G20 is struggling to have a common standard on geopolitical crises. And he wasn't wrong. The summit revealed something many already suspected. The G20 is powerful as a platform for discussion, but limited as an engine for decisive action. Yet despite these limits, something interesting happened. Countries across Africa and the global South didn't leave the summit discouraged. They left energized, because for once, the issues that mattered to them were treated as central, not peripheral. This raises the next question, one that captures the heart of Johannesburg's significance. If the G20 struggled to deliver solutions, why did this summit still feel like a major victory for Africa and the global South? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If you judge the Johannesburg summit only by the outcomes written on paper, you might conclude it didn't change much. No breakthrough on Ukraine. No new framework for the Middle East. No binding commitments on debt relief. But if you judge it by something deeper, by the shift in tone, in ownership, in who drove the agenda, then it becomes clear why so many leaders walked away feeling that something significant had happened. For decades, Africa has been invited to major global forums mostly as a participant, rarely as a driver. The continent's issues were mentioned, but often in side conversations, footnotes, or brief acknowledgments. Johannesburg changed that dynamic. It wasn't just that Africa hosted the summit, it was Africa that shaped it. From the moment the summit opened, South Africa made its priorities clear. Inequality, climate vulnerability, debt pressure, and fair access to green energy. These weren't afterthoughts. They weren't inserted into the agenda because it felt polite or politically correct. They were placed at the center and major powers agreed to engage with them. That alone was a shift in global politics. And then there was the African Union. This was its first summit as a full member of the G20, not as a guest. That change carried weight. It meant Africa's collective voice was no longer optional. It was part of the decision-making core. More than 20 African nations also attended as participants, creating a presence that felt different, fuller, stronger, and far more coordinated. In moments, the significance of this shift became visible. For example, when Ramaphosa finished his closing speech and leaders from other continents moved in to congratulate him, you could see a level of respect that wasn't rooted in courtesy alone. It came from the way South Africa handled a complicated summit, especially one overshadowed by a US boycott. And in that small hot mic moment, Ramaphosa quietly said, "It was not easy." You could hear the weight he carried behind the scenes, pressure from all sides, expectations from African nations, the responsibility of hosting a divided world. It wasn't easy, but it mattered. Organizations like Oxfam described the summit as historic because inequality, a crisis affecting billions, was placed at the heart of the global agenda for the first time. Leaders from Namibia and other African nations stressed that development priorities, seen from Africa's perspective, were finally given real attention. For countries that have long tried to make the world understand their challenges, this recognition wasn't symbolic. It was overdue. And even though the declaration wasn't binding, it set a tone the rest of the world could no longer ignore. Africa is claiming its place in global leadership, and others are noticing. But that brings us to the final question, the one that ties every moment of this summit together. If Africa stepped forward in Johannesburg, what does this shift mean for the United States as it prepares to host the next G20 summit? When the dust settled in Johannesburg, one thing became impossible to ignore. The world had just completed a major global summit without the United States sitting at the table. Not as a late arrival, not as a quiet observer, as a full absence. And that absence didn't weaken the summit. It weakened America's position at it. The G20 didn't collapse. The agenda didn't stall. The declaration didn't wait. Instead, the summit adapted and kept moving. And in that adaptation, something subtle but important happened. Global leadership began reshaping itself in real time. For years, the United States has been accustomed to setting the tone for these gatherings. Whether people liked Washington's decisions or not, they rarely ignored them. But Johannesburg created a very different picture. It showed a world increasingly willing to continue without American involvement when necessary. China leaned in, Europe leaned in, Russia leaned in. Dozens of African nations leaned in. And the empty US chair, symbolic, unavoidable, became a reminder that influence fades quickly when a country stops showing up. This is where the shift becomes more than symbolic. The United States will lead the G20 next year. That was already decided long before the Johannesburg summit. Trump has already announced his intention to host it at his Doral Golf Club in Florida. But leadership isn't automatic. It isn't inherited like a turn in a rotation. It is earned through presence, engagement, and credibility. And that credibility took a visible hit in Johannesburg. Other nations noticed. They noticed that the US skipped a summit during a moment when Africa was stepping forward with clarity. They noticed that South Africa, despite the pressure of the boycott, managed the summit smoothly, confidently, and with more unity than many expected. They noticed that the major world powers supported Africa's priorities, even without Washington's guiding hand. And they notice something else too, a quiet willingness of the global community to move ahead collectively even when the United States chooses not to participate. The question now isn't whether the United States can lead next year. It can. The question is what version of America will show up. Will it be a country ready to re-engage, rebuild trust, and listen to the shifting concerns of the global South? Or will it continue down a path where political disagreements at home translate into diplomatic withdrawal abroad? Because Johannesburg made one thing clear. The world no longer waits automatically for Washington to take the first step. Influence cannot be assumed. It must be demonstrated. And alliances cannot be maintained simply by showing power. They require presence, cooperation, and respect for the issues that matter to other nations. The G20 is entering a new phase, one where Africa's voice is louder, where global inequality is finally treated as a central crisis, and where major powers outside the West are shaping the table more confidently than ever before. So the real question, as the baton passes to the United States, is simple. When the world gathers again under America's leadership, will the U.S. choose to lead, or will it choose to sit out once more? Let us know in the comments section. Does that even matter? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.